Hi, it's the Godward Show. Here at the Godward Show, we do better than lukewarm takes on the literary, historical, and philosophical tradition. Western canon stuff, old school style. My name's Casey, and I do this because I love it. I love it. Please share with a friend. I ordered a copy of Lucian's Selected Dialogues recently, on the advice of a friend, not really knowing what to expect. Apparently he was much better known during the Renaissance. He was born around 125 AD, and he died not long after Marcus Aurelius, probably in the 180s. He was from Samosata, which, if you look it up on a map, maybe I'll splice one in here, is a really interesting place, actually. I mean, geographically. It's not very far from Göbekli Tepe in Asia Minor. Certainly a place of cultural and political palimpsest even in Lucian's time. The place had been Hellenized before he was born, but was Roman by the time Lucian was sort of hitting middle age. This phase of history is sometimes called the Second Sophistic Era, which I wish I knew more about, to be honest, but the introduction here in my book says it meant that the writers of the period sort of looked backward nostalgically and admiringly to the great classics of the 4th and 5th centuries BC. So they sort of emulated Plato, Thucydides, Demosthenes, and so on. The intro also says that Greek may have been an adopted language for Lucian, and he probably spoke Aramaic natively, although he's a really good writer in Greek, no doubt. He's noted for his humor, and in particular for writing a bunch of dialogues in the style of Plato, but I selected almost at random to start with his shortish essay titled Alexander, or the False Prophet, because, well, not everybody thinks I'm right about God lately and how to know him, so I guess, LOL. The essay is really a personal attack on a man who became a special enemy to Lucian, and it takes the form of a letter that he wrote to someone called Celsus, who is very likely, at least again according to the intro, not the Celsus who was the opponent of Origen, the early Christian writer. So what's in the letter? It's a really vivid and funny and telling report of the decade or so leading up to 180 AD. Part of what makes it so interesting to me is to think about this in relation to the timeline, as I call it. I'm always suggesting that you make a mental timeline of this period, really of all history, and fill it in your mind as you go, so that you can people your history from all of our various favorite sources, everybody including Thucydides to Boethius. Lucian was born under Hadrian's reign. And he was a young boy, when Jerusalem was finally wrecked to the ground around 132. So you can kind of begin to build his own timeline in your head, his own, sense of where he was and what was going on. If you ever watched the movie Gladiator, that's the time period we're trying to conjure here. Marcus Aurelius was emperor, at least by 161 AD. Justin Martyr was writing his dialogue with Trypho the Jew around this time. Again, by this time, Christians had a large presence in Asia Minor, and I imagine the story of the riot in Ephesus, which is related in Acts chapter 19, about giving up the idols of Artemis, was probably widely known in the region already. So that's the setting for Lucian's description of a guy named Alexander, whom he calls the quack from Abonoteichus, which is in the center of, sort of north center of Turkey. And let me just kind of cut to the quick of it first. This Alexander that he's talking about was the founder of what came to be known as the Glycon cult, and he claimed to be the reincarnation of Asclepius, the healer god thing. Lucian thinks he's an absolute charlatan, this Alexander, a total phony, and this letter is an attempt to expose him. But at the same time, I think Lucian gives us a really revealing window into how people thought at this time period and what sorts of things they were really interested in or were looking for. If you look again at your map and recognize that this guy from northern Turkey became very famous all the way down, everywhere from there all the way down to Rome, he was a major celebrity. and many people believed him to be a kind of demigod. Men, or I should say cucks, gave their wives to him to impregnate, and some even sent their children to learn under him, and from what you can tell in this story, kind of to lose their dignity to him sexually. So it's kind of a grotesque story too. Lucian's first interesting note about all this is that Alexander was beautiful. He had great physiognomy, he was tall with a fair complexion, his eyes flashed like one possessed, while his voice was very clear and pleasant. The outer, to use the terms I've been using in my last few videos, was faultless. But Lucian says, as for his soul and his mind, well, quite the opposite. But not because he was dumb, rather because he was a kind of evil genius. Now listen to this awesome little description of Alexander. Quote, "In intelligence, sagacity, and shrewdness, he was far ahead of everyone. And as for an inquiring mind, a readiness to learn, memory, and a natural capacity for knowledge, every single one of these qualities he had in excess for every occasion. But he used them for the worst purposes, and equipped with noble instruments, he lost no time in becoming the most accomplished of those who have been notorious for wickedness." Lucian even goes on to say that even Pythagoras would have seemed a child in comparison. I recently posted a patrons-only video where I tried to just kind of marvel at the minds of some of these ancients. I mean, I know where I stand intellectually, more or less, and it's not on Pythagoras' level or even on Lucian's level, not even close. So it's just staggering to me to think that Lucian would describe this guy, his enemy, as making Pythagoras seem like a baby. Let me just read you the rest of this initial description, because it's interesting, but also because it's a good sample of Lucian's writing. He says, again, of Alexander, quote, "I ask you to imagine and carefully picture the most complex psychological temperament, consisting of lying, perjury, and malice, a temperament which is unscrupulous, daring, reckless, energetic in forwarding its own schemes, persuasive, plausible, making a pretense of virtue, and with an appearance totally opposite to its real purpose. Indeed, no one who met him for the first time failed to go away with the impression that he was the worthiest and most honest of men, and the most artless and unaffected as well. In addition to all this, he had the character of a high achiever, and of one who designed nothing petty, but always had his mind set on the highest things." Isn't that a great description of a man? Especially when you recall that the description is written by one of his chief enemies. I mean, okay, but here's how his life went, Alexander's. He was very good looking, as I said, in his youth, and it says he sold his favors freely and went with anyone who would pay his company, which I'm not sure how to take that exactly, but this was the time of that sort of pederastia thing, and it does seem like he kind of fell in with this like doctor healer guy who had been a follower of the famous Apollonius of Tyana. I guess he became that guy's lover, kind of. Anyway, he learned under him, to deal in medicine for, good and ill. But this guy that he had fallen in with, the doctor healer guy, died, actually, and so Alexander had to find a new path. He quickly joined forces with a Byzantine chorus writer nicknamed Cocoanus, whom Lucian says was a much more disgusting character, and they traveled around practicing witchcraft and quackery and fleecing the thick-headed, as charlatans usually refer to the public. And this is one of the running themes of the letter, basically that the people of the region, again we're in like northern Turkey, are essentially country bumpkins who will fall for anything. And Alexander, 3 or 4 standard deviations above them on the IQ chart, basically made a living selling them their own stupidity back to them. So anyway, his next move is key to the whole thing and explains my hand-drawn thumbnail. Did anyone see this? Again, please like the video if you enjoyed that. Anyway, these two guys sort of make a mark of an aging lady who is still trying hard to look, kind of beautiful or whatever, in the city of Pella. they go with her to her hometown, and the place was kind of famous, I guess, for for breeding these giant snakes that were very tame, totally harmless. So they bought the finest one of these reptiles and began their next racket. Lucian says, "Human life is at the mercy of the two great tyrannies of hope and fear." And Alexander understood that, quote, anyone who could exploit both of these would very quickly get rich. So their plan was to set up an oracular shrine, something like the famous Delphic temple. So here's how they did it. To accomplish all this, they chose a city full of idiots, Alexander's hometown, and buried some bronze tablets in the temple of Apollo, which stated that Asclepius and his father Apollo would soon be moving to Pontus and settling in Abonoteichus, which is the hometown of Alexander. Then they made sure someone discovered these tablets, and this caused the story to spread easily all around Bithynia and Pontus. The people there at once voted to build a temple and lost no time digging the foundations. So at this point, Alexander's buddy Coconus got bitten by a viper and died. I don't think it just seems odd, but that's what happened. So he's on his own now. Next we hear of him, Alexander has grown his hair long, and it's falling in ringlets, and he wears a purple and white tunic covered by a white cloak. He carries a scimitar like Perseus, and everyone was convinced he was a real sorcerer. To add the finishing touches to all this, he pretended to have periodical fits of madness together with foaming of the mouth, which Lucian makes a point of saying he contrived by chewing the root of soapwort. Next part of his plan was to, this is amazing, doctor an egg. So he cracked it open, he inserted a baby snake into the egg, covered the crack in the egg, with sealing wax and white lead, and then put the egg, in the foundation of the temple. There's like a water pit under there. And the next day he went into town wearing nothing except a gilded loincloth and started shaking his hair wildly, and he climbed up on an altar, addressed the people. His audience were astounded. Lucian says, listen to this, quote, he uttered some meaningless words sounding like Hebrew or Phoenician, which dazed the people who didn't know what he was saying, except for his constant mentioning of the names of Apollo and Asclepius, end quote. And by the way, guys, I gotta say, at this point, I got a little uncomfortable thinking about the Apostle Paul making his way through this very same landscape just about 100 years earlier, telling the Galatians about a dead and resurrected Hebrew man. And to be honest, it didn't exactly inspire confidence in the judgment of the locals. But that's all I'll say about that, I guess. Soon enough, again, quote, the city was full to bursting with people, all of them already deprived, Lucian says, of their minds and their senses, in no way resembling bread-eating men and differing from cattle only in their shape. I mean, yikes, right? And so anyway, in front of all these people, Alexander went and extracted the egg he had doctored, pulled it out, with the little baby snake in it when he cracked it open. And as he opened it, he, showed it to the people and said to them, this is the reborn Asclepius, and they're all amazed by this. Then Alexander went home. This is so funny. He got the big old domesticated python snake that he had picked up from that aging lady back in Pella. And then which apparently this snake would take any level of abuse and was, not harmful and could be manipulated and whatever, though it was alive. And then he sewed together a weird linen head for the snake that looked part human and part snake and could be like manipulated with horse hairs and stuff. And he waited a couple of days, and then Lucian's description of him is so perfect, I'm just going to read it to you. Listen. Quote, now, Lucian says, please picture a small room, not brightly lit nor letting in too much daylight, and a motley crowd of humanity, agitated, excited and advanced, buoyed up with hopes. When they went in, the thing naturally seemed a miracle to them. that a tiny little snake should in so few days become a great serpent, and what's more, with a human face, and so docile. So he would sometimes let them come in and like pet the real snake part of it, and see its weird looking head that looked kind of human. I mean, this is like, I guess probably maybe P.T. Barnum pulled off some similar bullcrap among the idiotic crowds of the 19th century in America or something. And maybe this is even how cable news works now. But again, it doesn't exactly inspire me with confidence in the human species, in our collective judgment, and so on. Lucian does say, however, that the illusion was really well done. So the point is that this guy sat there in a dark room with a big, long python wrapped around him, hiding the python's head in his tunic, and making it appear that the python's long and wriggling tail, which again patrons could pay to touch, culminated in a bizarre, supernatural-looking head that could stick its tongue out using some hidden manipulations and so on. So just an amazing racket. So once he pulled this trick, a few times and got away with it, his celebrity exploded. He next started the, subsequent phase of all this by proclaiming to all comers, quote, that the god would be delivering oracles on a day he stated in advance. So people would bring, they would put down on paper whatever whatever they wanted and wished to learn, tie it up and seal it with wax in like an envelope or clay or whatever, and then they would hand it to Alexander, and then he would take it for a couple of days and then return it to them a few days later, still sealed. That's part of the key here, and now with answers written on the outside of the envelopes. Okay, amazing, right? Well, Lucian says, to these, this is quote, to these driveling idiots, it was an almost incredible prodigy. But of course it was all fake. And Lucian explains that Alexander would heat up a needle and melt the wax seal and then, open it and read what's in there so that he could write replies that were relevant, and reheat the needle, seal the wax, and make it appear unbroken so that he could read the requests and sort of, write a couple of relevant, appropriate lines of seeming prophecy that might seem plausible. Again, this whole account is helpful and instructive for the insight into the world that existed in Asia Minor around 165 AD, which to me is really interesting because it's just as the Christian church was sort of getting its roots into the ground, Lucian says, quote,
"By this time, Alexander was also sending people abroad to spread reports of the oracle among other nations, and to announce that he gave prophecies, found runaway slaves, detected thieves and robbers, showed the way to buried treasure, healed the sick, and sometimes raised the dead."
As you might expect, soon enough, some people got wise to what was going on. Lucian's phrasing here is really interesting. He says, quote, "When many people of good sense came to themselves, as it were from a deep intoxication, and banded together against him, especially the followers of Epicurus, they gradually saw through the trickery and contrivances by which the thing was staged." Pausing here for a second, I gotta say, I was listening to Brett Weinstein's podcast, the Dark Horse podcast with Heather, and Heather was saying, as the story sort of falls apart, the official story that we've all been told from NPR and CNN and stuff, she's wondering how it is that the people who went all in on the story, the people who fell to their knees in gratitude when the shot was made available and all that, how are they gonna kind of come out of that narrative and return to normal reality? And she was saying, maybe they won't be able to because it's too mind-cracking, it's too humiliating or something, I don't know, it's interesting, but I like that idea of as coming out of a deep intoxication. Anyway, these people kind of waking up to the trickery, Lucian goes on to say that, they started pushing back, but in response, Alexander issued a threatening proclamation against them, stating that Pontus was so full of, quote, atheists and Christians who did not scruple to utter the foulest abuse about him. So, I guess, again, it's kind of nice to hear that the Christians didn't fall for this charlatan's stooge act, at least. Lucian is quite admiring of Epicurus, by the way, and that's another interesting element here. It makes me want to read more Epicurus, actually. I don't know if his book is extant or if I can just read about him or whatever. I've never really made a study of Epicurus. But it's fun to imagine being a denizen of central Gaul and having to choose between these incipient religions. On the one hand, the Glycon cult of Alexander. Maybe you could stick with your traditional cult of Artemis, or you could choose Christianity, which was a new cult that was not much older either. These were your choices in central to northern Turkey at the time. Here's what Lucian reports about this battle of ideas. He says, quote, "The war Alexander waged with Epicurus was without negotiations or truce, and not surprisingly. Who else would be a more justified object of attack from a quack who loved marvels and hated truth than Epicurus, with his keen perception of the nature of things and his unique knowledge of the truth in them? Alexander regarded the schools of Plato and Chrysippus and Pythagoras as his friends, and there was a deep peace between them. But the relentless Epicurus, for so he called him, was bitterly opposed to him, and rightly so, as he regarded all these activities as childish and ridiculous." So definitely let's give the Epicureans a point in their column here for, like the Christians, not falling for some of the more ridiculous bullcrap circulating at the time. When his fame reached Rome, the same thing happened there that had happened up there in northern Turkey. Everyone tried to get to him first, especially those who had the highest power and status in the city, interestingly. Like every charlatan pretending to be a priest, Alexander made sure to pay most of his attention to the wealthy. The oracles he gave were called autophones, and Lucian says they were not issued to everyone without distinction, but only to those who were well-dressed, rich, and generous. This is how I do my patrons-only videos. It's like only for the well-dressed, rich, and well-to-do, and so on. His prediction, in this case, didn't hit the mark, and didn't very often. But he even went so far as to invent a kind of like Orwellian, what he called a retrospective oracle, where he would replace in his archive the oracles that appeared wrong with newly written ones to accommodate what actually took place. At least one of his followers, a guy named Rutilianus, followed Alexander all the way to destruction, working himself into a full-blown madness, trying to interpret and explain the oracles in a manner that kept Alexander's mystique intact. The whole city became agitated, and eventually Alexander started even blackmailing some of the more powerful, politically active members of Rome, basically threatening to dox them or whatever, to read off the contents of the request that they had handed him in the letters and so on. So it's all very sketchy. Lucian continues, quote, "Once he had got Italy in the bag, Alexander's plans became ever more wide-ranging, and he sent oracle mongers to every part of the Roman Empire. He sent round an oracle to all the nations during the Great Plague, consisting of one line: Phoebus with hair unshorn averts the dark cloud of the plague." Which is interesting. I mean, it's almost like Passover-like or something. I'm not sure what they would have done about it, but it says apparently for years to come, until the plague fully subsided, you could see this phrase inscribed above doors and on city gates throughout the empire. Kind of a fascinating little historical footnote here, if nothing else, and it goes to show that people will sometimes fall into superstitious thinking when it comes to disease prevention. Anyway, Alexander also organized his own initiation rite, something called the Feast of Torches, which involved pretty wild stuff. For example, the proclamation on day 1 stated, "If any atheist or Christian or Epicurean has come to spy on our ceremonies, off with them. But those who believe in the god may perform the rites. The good fortune be their lot." What did they do at these ceremonies, these initiation rites? Well, of course, they lit torches. But also, some wild stuff on a stage where some beautiful wife of some cuck procurator from Rome was lowered from the ceiling by a special rope onto Alexander, where she like makes out with him, and Lucian says they would have done more if it hadn't been for the torchlight illuminating them. Lucian calls the procurator her worthless husband. Apparently, Alexander's doctrines were sort of standard, what you might imagine for like a prophet cult. For example, he warned everyone to abstain from having sex with boys as being an unholy practice. But then, wouldn't you know it, he used to gather up choir boys and treat them like slaves, sleeping with them, using them offensively in every way. His only rule was to never kiss any of the boys who were over 18 years old. And he also ruined women promiscuously, Lucian says. The rivalry with the Epicureans actually gets very serious when they threaten to uncover Alexander's tricks. At one point, he convinced a crowd to stone one of his Epicurean accusers to death, and that guy narrowly escaped. Lucian makes a good joke about this. He says, quote, "And quite right, too. What need had he, the Epicurean, to be the only sane man among such lunatics, and be on the receiving end of Paphlagonian stupidity?" In other words, he'd be better off dead almost. After that debacle, Alexander took a copy of Epicurus's writings into the town square and made a show of lighting them on fire, quote, as if he were burning the man himself. Again, Lucian's comment here makes me want to read Epicurus. He says, Alexander did not realize what a source of blessings that book is for its readers, and what peace, tranquility, and freedom it produces in them, releasing them from fears, delusions, and prodigies, from vain hopes and excessive desires, instilling understanding and truth into them, and really purifying their judgments, not with torch and squills and that sort of rubbish, but with right reasoning, truth, and frank speaking. So yeah, high praise for Epicurus here. When the pressure picked up and people were really looking more closely at Alexander, his oracles became more and more ambiguous. Eventually, he attracted interpreters who would actually sit around outside the temple, and people who paid to get an oracle from Alexander would then pay the interpreters to make sense of the oracle. Again, this is a great racket. I mean, where can we set this up, guys? This is a business idea. Lucian himself says that just to debunk the whole thing, he went with trick questions a few times, asking things like, when will Alexander expose himself as a fraud inside the envelope? But, saying that he asked a different question each time as he handed over the envelope, verbally saying this is a question about whatever, some political concern. And then he would get back an answer that was totally wrong or irrelevant, and this proved to him that it was complete charlatanism. Mountebankism. Eventually, the two had a few confrontations. They met in person. The best one of these is where Alexander offered his hand to Lucian to kiss, and Alexander took it and actually bit it, which of course led to a near beating, and then to a sort of weird standoff, kind of aloof, cold agreement. But Lucian, you can tell, really hated this guy right to the end. Lucian ends the letter by mentioning that Alexander had predicted that he would live to be 150 and then die from being struck by lightning. But in fact, quote, he suffered a most miserable death before he reached 70. Appropriately for a son of Podilarius, his leg became gangrenous up to the groin and he was infested with maggots. Podilarius, poda, the foot, whatever. Then, as the physicians tried to relieve his suffering by rubbing ointment on his scalp, they discovered he was wearing a wig. This, I think, is a kind of final insult told by Lucian against Alexander. Overall, a really good read. I recommend it, and I'll continue reading the rest of this book. Feel free to vote for more content from Lucian by clicking the like button and sharing with your mom. Or even better, join my Patreon for a mere $5 a month to get the 2 live streams that we do every month.
I'm thinking of adding a $10 option where I handwrite and send as a PDF oracles written in dactylic hexameter for each of the $10 patrons.
I was joking when I wrote this, but if you want it, let me know. Thanks for watching the Godward Podcast. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.